The man stares without expression straight into the camera. A full face shot, followed by a profile. What is this? A passport application? Or maybe a mug shot taken at a police station? Unfortunately, the truth is far more disturbing. The man in the photo is 31-year-old Cambodian national Van Nath, and the photographs were taken upon his arrival at the Tuol Sleng Interrogation Centre, or as it was more commonly known, Security Centre S-21. From the estimated 16 to 18,000 men, women and children who entered S-21, Van Nath is one of only 7 people known to have survived. So to set the scene, these events take place during the era of the Cold War, which was characterised in many Southeast Asian nations by internal struggles between ruling regimes and various Marxist-Leninist groups who were striving to take power by any and all means necessary. And Cambodia was no exception. From 1970 to 1975, a civil war had been fought in the rural areas of Cambodia. A war between the Khmer Republic, a Western-backed military regime which had seized power in 1970, and the Marxist communist group known as the Khmer Rouge. By April of 1975, the fighting had reached the outskirts of Phnom Penh, the Cambodian capital, and the writing was on the wall for the incumbent military government. The city fell to the communist Khmer Rouge, thus ending the civil war. The de facto leader of the Khmer Rouge, a man calling himself Pol Pot, and was also known as Brother Number One, soon afterwards became Cambodia's new Prime Minister, but anyone hoping for an end to misery and strife were to be sorely disappointed. Cambodia's problems were only just beginning. Pol Pot and his inner circle of lieutenants had a vision of society where all trappings of wealth, status and capitalism had been completely abolished, and the people of Cambodia were living in a rural utopia, working together on cooperative farms to make Cambodia self-sufficient and equal. This vision was to be imposed upon the entire Cambodian population, and no cost was to be too great to bear, no amount of suffering would be too much. No matter how many had to be sacrificed, nothing would stand in the way of Cambodia's great march forwards towards agrarian communism. Education and intellectualism were seen as potential dangers to the Pol Pot regime, so just having soft hands, being able to speak a foreign language, or even just wearing glasses was enough to have one singled out as being educated, and therefore potentially harmful to the state. Many of these so-called educated individuals were purged from society, their bodies buried in the fields to act as fertiliser. Cambodia was renamed, Democratic Kampuchea it now was. Money and official religion were abolished, and the calendar was changed. 1975 became Year Zero. Pol Pot's Great Reset had begun. Following this national rebranding, ethnic and religious cleansing was next on Pol Pot's agenda, with Buddhist monks being especially singled out as non-persons, along with any ethnic Vietnamese. The cities were emptied, and Cambodia's entire urban population was forcibly relocated to the countryside, condemned to a life of back-breaking work on collective farms, overseen by the young, sadistic Khmer Rouge guards who had carte blanche to treat the workers in any way they wanted. Life in the country became literally a living nightmare for millions of ordinary Cambodians, the entire country having become one giant forced labour camp. But if there was one place in the new Cambodia that you definitely did not want to get sent to, it was Security Centre S-21. Enemies of the state, and this could include pretty much anyone, from teachers to academics, monks, engineers, former government workers, anyone who looked in any way intelligent, could easily find themselves with a one-way ticket to Centre S-21. For example, Van Nath had originally been sent to a woodcutting camp in the forest, but he'd soon been arrested for counter-revolutionary activities and sent to S-21. He arrived there on the 7th of January 1978. He was prisoner number 55 that day. S-21, or Tuol Sleng, was formerly the Tuol Sleng High School, located in the outskirts of Phnom Penh. The Khmer Rouge had transformed this group of 5 nondescript modern-looking buildings into a prison-cum-interrogation centre for any individuals deemed worthy of attention from the top brass of the Khmer Rouge. Bars were placed on windows, classrooms were transformed into cells and torture chambers, iron gates and an electrified fence surrounded the complex. The numbers were low at first, with maybe only 100 or so inmates interred there in the first few weeks. But the regime was fastidious in its bureaucracy at S-21, making sure that all arrivals were numbered and photographed, weighed, measured, and interviewed at length. Pretty soon the number of daily arrivals was ramping up. The on-site photographer, Naeem Ain, and his 5 assistants worked tirelessly from 7 a.m, photographing the newly arrived prisoners, sometimes as many as 500 a day. The head of Tuol Sleng was a former school teacher named Kang Kech Eve, or as he was now known, Brother Dutch. Tasked with making sure that Pol Pot was happy that his enemies were being exterminated, he ran S-21 with a sick efficiency. Specific days were set aside for the elimination of various types of prisoners. One day it might be the wives of enemies, another day the children, on a different day factory workers, and so on. The obsession with photographing the prisoners, alive and dead, was all part of the desire to prove to Pol Pot that his enemies had indeed been disposed of. Conditions here were appalling to say the least. I'm afraid that if I go into details, just describing the horror of daily life in S-21 would get this video immediately slapped with a YouTube age restriction. So all I'm going to say is that basically if you ended up here, you weren't coming back out again, and what little remained of your life spent in Centre S-21 would be so inhumane and horrible that death would probably be a merciful release. From an estimated 16 to 18,000 people who were sent there, only 7 survived, usually because they could provide some sort of service to the regime. In the case of Van Nath, his artistic talents were put to use, painting large murals dedicated to the greatness of the new regime and to the brilliance of Brother Number 1, Pol Pot. The Khmer Rouge regime lasted 4 terrible years, from 1975 to 1979. Following an event known as the Ba Chuk Massacre, where Khmer Rouge soldiers crossed into Vietnam and murdered over 3,000 unarmed Vietnamese civilians, Cambodia was then invaded by the Vietnamese army. A brief spell of fighting routed the poorly trained Khmer Rouge forces, and Pol Pot and his cronies fled Phnom Penh, taking refuge in the northern jungles close to the Thai border. When Vietnamese troops entered the capital city, they found it eerily deserted. The photographs show empty streets that look like something out of a post-apocalyptic movie. At S-21, the troops discovered the sheer brutality and depravity of the Khmer Rouge regime. There were no living inmates left to testify, but the horrors found in the rooms and cells told their own story. There were no soldiers or guards, just some abandoned toddlers wandering in the road near the facility who were picked up by the Vietnamese troops. It's estimated that 1.8 million Cambodians died while under the rule of the Khmer Rouge. Now that's about a quarter of the entire population that were either murdered, died of starvation or illness, or were worked to death in what became known as the killing fields of Cambodia. Brother Number 1, Pol Pot, never faced justice. He died in 1998, still hiding out in the jungle with the remnants of his Khmer Rouge army. Some high-ranking members of the Khmer Rouge did defect during the 1990s, incredibly being pardoned by the king and returning to high-ranking positions within the Cambodian government. It seemed that very few had any interest in bringing the leaders of this genocide to justice. Indeed, it took until 2007 for the United Nations to even officially recognise that genocide had been committed by the Khmer Rouge. Brother Dutch, the guy that ran S-21, was eventually jailed in 2012. But it wasn't until 2018 that 3 of Pol Pot's top lieutenants, who were now in their 80s, were finally jailed for their roles in the Cambodian genocide. many of those involved in the mass killing of innocent people simply got away with it, living out the rest of their natural lives at liberty. It remains, in my opinion, one of the great travesties of justice of the 20th century that killing and cruelty on such a scale should basically have been forgiven or forgotten by the international community and the successive Cambodian governments. In 1993, two visiting Americans, Chris Riley and Doug Niven, discovered the photographic archive of the victims of S-21 in a rusty filing cabinet in the back room at the Tuol Sleng camp. Their efforts at restoring and preserving the photographs have ensured that around 6,000 of the originals survive. They are now on display at S-21, which has been turned into a museum dedicated to keeping alive the memory of the victims of Tuol Sleng and the horror of life under the Khmer Rouge. The survivor Van Nath worked there until his death in 2011. These haunting photographs survive to this day, an important reminder as to what happens when fanatical obsession with ideology overcomes simple, basic humanity. Now, I don't care what your politics are, but if your vision of utopia involves the removal of a large part of the population to achieve it, then you're evil and you're wrong. It's as simple as that. Obviously, I've just scratched the surface of this topic in this short video. For those looking to learn more about this awful and somewhat forgotten piece of history, the 1984 film The Killing Fields is set during the fall of Cambodia, and the book Surviving the Killing Fields is an extraordinary first-hand account of what daily life was like during the Khmer Rouge reign of terror.